Today I have a couple of boat seats out of a Triton bass boat. I want to go through some of the things that I look at before I actually start doing the seats. That may help you guys think about boat seats a little bit differently and show you guys it's a good starting point for anyone trying to get into upholstery. So people always look at the seats, obviously, when you get them done, look for imperfections, see how straight your stitch pattern is and stuff. But whenever they buy new boats, no one seems to pay attention to that. And let me show you what I mean. These are factory seat covers. Look at this French seam, okay? So we have an issue here where the stitch isn't exactly parallel from both sides of the blind stitch there in the middle. But, I mean, that's not too bad. But whenever you get all the way down here, you notice where the real problem shows, you know? But these are the things that people don't really look at whenever they're buying a new boat. Not nearly as much as if they got new seat covers done. Same here, we've got this double fell around this whole entire area here, this nice top stitch all the way around. But as you can see, we're about an 1/8 inch gap right here, maybe 3/8 of a gap here, and then, you know, real close to the edge there. So the consistency is really not that clean. Now, obviously, we don't want to allow ourselves that much of tolerance and get away with things like that. We want to make sure it's nice and pristine as best as our abilities are going to allow us to do. But at the same time, it shows us what the good starting point for boats really is for us. The construction of both these seats should be identical as well, but what I'm going to do is, this is the driver's seat and this is the passenger seat on the boat. And I'm going to actually take the passenger seat apart first, and I'm actually going to use this for the pattern of both seats. Considering the seats are pretty much a mirrored copy of one another, I could use each other's pattern to pattern the new seat covers, but I'm going to start with the passenger seat because it is more intact and has seen a little bit less wear and tear than the driver's seat has. So that's why we're going to start with this one. So now what I'm going to do is actually just take all these covers off of the actual seat itself. It should be 6 covers, if not 8 covers altogether, looking at the whole thing. So I'm going to break this seat down, and then we're going to go over exactly what I'm looking at before I take the seat covers apart into individual panels themselves. This is also a good point to take all the pictures that you need necessary for attachment points later on. So I will actually go through and take all kinds of pictures and see how exactly all the factory things are stapled down in place. And I'm also going to mark the edge of this perimeter where it actually wraps around the plastic and stuff with a Sharpie marker. And I'll go and show you my little process of doing that after I've got it all flipped around for you guys. So we're on the underside of the seat now, and as you can see, I actually marked the perimeter. As I squish this foam, you can kind of see that is that line where the fabric is actually touching the plastic. So that's going to be my alignment point for whenever I come over and staple in it again. It allows this line here to be as symmetrical as it is now with the panels there. Now, that is nothing but a guideline. It is not my law of where that panel's going to go. So if I bring my new material around to this area and I notice, oh, it's still pretty loose, I'm not going to leave that material baggy. I'm going to pull it further and staple later. So something else I also do here is whenever I have the marks where I'm going to have my alignment points, I'll put +S on the other side of the material, and that just tells me to add salvage to the back side of this, something to actually staple onto. And then I'll go and just take my razor blade on these plastic seats. I'm going to do this on an automobile, but boat seats are a little bit more cavemen. So I take that edge, cut that off, and then I'm going to take this with a piece of pliers and rip up, and it's going to pick up most of those staples. And then I'll go through and take the rest of the staples out as well. So I'm going to do that around the whole entire perimeter of the whole entire seat here. Some bass boat seats have one problem. There's always hardware underneath some of these emblems. I believe there's a screw underneath this holding this headrest to the actual seat frame itself. So I've got to pry the chrome away from the black edge. And as you can see, there's already a crack forming at the bottom before I even pried it before. So I'm going to be as gentle as I possibly can to get this off, but there is a small chance that this is either going to break and need to replace, or delaminate the silver off the back side of it. And therefore we're going to have to figure out a way to make that look good again whenever we have to reinstall it. That or delete it completely and put a new emblem of our own on top of it. There was some light damage pulling it off. The backside has some foam double-sided sticky tape on it, but it was able to reveal these 3 screws there. So I may be able to peel all of this backing off and be able to reuse this, but I am still going to look for new ones because as you can see on this edge here, it actually has some cracking on the emblem itself. For reference, what I actually did was just, I found a piece that wasn't attached very well and was able to put my Skinner or my 4140 underneath of that, and then I worked it all the way around the edge, being able to pull from it with some pretty good pressure on the whole entire flat area instead of just the edge of it. Another thing boat manufacturers like to do a lot is they'll actually dig a screw through material that they know is not going to really be seen. So I can promise you that where that little notch is there is actually a screw underneath the material. So what they do is they pull the foam back, they pull the material through, and then when that material is kind of up against or up and away from the plastic, they'll drive a screw through the material, popping through, with the head popping through the material and then hiding the screw, fastening the plastic to the actual seat base itself. And then just using a drill, I was able to find that head and pop it through. So now I'll just back it the rest of the way through and take the headrest off. This logo as well is going to have some screws underneath of it holding the actual base for the emblem in place on the seats and allowing the actual logo itself to cover the screws. So I'll be prying along that as well, taking that piece of adhesive off. Taking these covers off too, you'll notice that things have to come off in layers. So I've got this top taken off here to allow this foam to get removed, to actually remove the staples for the bottom half of the seat. So obviously pay attention to that as you're reassembling the seat. Reassemble things the exact opposite way that you took it apart. I got the top cover off here. I'm just going to pop this foam off, making sure I've got all my staples removed. I have removed all the covers from the seat base now, and I will let it sit and dry off. It was wet. This one luckily is completely dry. As you can see, there's plastic on all the foam that's been adhered to it. Sometimes it likes to move and gather in certain areas, so I would basically just trim all that stuff off and leave what is there on there, as long as I don't see any mold or mildew build up. This one's in pretty good shape, and the reason why they do put all that, why all of that plastic is on there is just to let the cover kind of float against the foam instead of grabbing the roughness of the foam, allowing it to free move and look as pretty as it possibly can. The seat base is taken apart. We are left with 3 covers. That's covering the actual main portion of the seat, the side bolsters, and the back side. The insert for the bottom, which still has a piece of foam inside of it. The insert for the back, which is velcroed on. And then the actual headrest piece itself. So these I'm going to set aside for right now, and we're just going to concentrate on the actual body of the seat. The bottom bolsters here are mirrored images of one another. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose whichever is the best of the sort here. And looking over at them, it looks like this one's ripped less. So this is the one I'm going to use for patterning because this is in the best shape. I'm going to actually mark on here too on what exactly I need. So what I actually need is I need 2 copies of this. So I put 2C on it. Plus I also need 2 mirrored of those. So 1 copy of this in mirror is going to be for the passenger seat. 1 copy of this in 1 mirror is going to be for the driver's seat. So I'm going to actually get 4 pieces out of this one pattern right here. So this one, discard it. It's not important to me. I'm going to keep it just in case I do need it for reference for any reason of the sort after I get this one all taken apart. This as well, this back piece, we obviously need 1 per seat. So I'm going to put 1 plus mirror. And then that lets me know exactly what I need there too. So I guess for consistency, I'll put a C there for 1 copy and 1 mirror. I've gotten to the habit of not doing this as much now that I've just had so much experience. I don't really pay attention to that kind of stuff anymore. But when training, that stuff is super, super important. Now we're going to go ahead and set that aside too, and we're just going to concentrate on taking this apart. So what I'm going to do is mark alignment marks on the face of these with some Sharpie. All of this is getting replaced. So I'm just going to literally write on the face of these with Sharpie. If you haven't paid attention, that's what I've been doing already. So I'm going to mark alignment marks, and this is going to be our guide points for whenever we're stitching the new pieces together, where exactly everything needs to line up. I'm going to do them periodically. I don't want them spaced together evenly throughout the whole entire thing. And on average, you maybe want one every 6 inches on a straight line, and if it's in a curved area, like you see this bolster right here is curved, I'll do one maybe every 2 to 3 inches. But I don't want them consistent. I don't want the line spacing to be consistent throughout the whole thing because you can actually misalign 2 panels together. So as you can see, I've got 2 really close together here. On this side of that same piece, I'll make sure to keep them kind of far apart so that I don't worry about being able to misalign this piece 180 with the other side. I'll also take in consideration where everything kind of meets. Like here at the seam, I've actually kind of got like a T. So top of the T, bottom of the T. And I'll mark that intersection on the piece that doesn't actually have the 2 pieces attached to one another. Same with the other side. So I'm going to do that across the whole entire cover. I try to make sure that there's at least 2 alignment marks on each piece, if not 3. So even though I know, I'm not going to misalign this piece because of the chances of symmetry here is obviously not going to be able to happen because I've got 2 lines and 1 line. If I was to do 2 lines, I'll make sure to keep one maybe an inch away from this edge and maybe maybe a half inch away from this edge, so that I can't accidentally flip-flop it if I get the pieces mixed up from a copy to a mirror piece. And then also, whenever you got little areas like this, I kind of have a lot of different motions real quickly. I try to put a couple more. As you can see, I've got 2 kind of close together there. And just get a little bit closer together in some of those detail areas that really matter. The big flat parts like this, I mean, that's probably too much there, to be honest, but getting a little crazy with it, just trying to pay attention to exactly what I want to show you guys. So the blind seams, or the seams that doesn't have a top seam on it, a lot of people would probably use a seam ripper with this kind of stuff to get the separation of these 2 panels, but what I like to use is a razor blade instead. I don't really care about cutting the material on accident because all this is going to get replaced anyways. These are just basically my templates to actually pattern onto new material. And then on top of that, I've never had a seam ripper that actually worked really well. This just seems like the quicker, easiest way, and I mean, these are relatively cheap, so replacing these every seat cover or every day of seat cover cuts isn't really a big issue. Alright, you're welcome for this next part, but what I like to do is take my big old fat gut. Well, I guess first what I do is I pin it against the table. So I've got some tension on this thing. And then I'll actually cut the actual stitches between each one, releasing the safety stitch. It's hard to do this while paying attention to the camera at the same time. Then once that's done, you can see it trying to unravel. And then I'll just put some tension on the table and cut that stitch, releasing these 2 panels from one another. And then, so this one I was able to release without having to come into a cross point for like an intersection or something like that. So you want to pay attention. You're taking the last piece that needs to be sewn apart first. So the way you can tell is kind of pay attention, like where am I going to get stuck in the maze? So let's say I want to try to cut this stitch first. Well, I can't start it because it's attached to this piece, and I can't finish it because it's attached to this piece. This piece had 0 intersections. It started on a raw edge and it ended on a raw edge. So I was able to take that one off first. I'm going to mark this with a 1 because it's the first piece I took apart. And whenever I go sew all the new pieces together, I'll sew from the biggest number down to 1. So I know that it's the reverse order of how I took the actual cover apart. So now looking at this piece, I see on this seam right here that I have a raw edge, and it goes all the way down to a raw edge here. So I can take this off secondly without running into another intersection that I'm going to have to stop and unseam something else. So this will be panel number 2. Over here, the opposite side of this bolster, looks like it's considering as a straight line from this raw edge all the way along the seam to this raw edge. Now this isn't a blind seam on either one of these sides. I've got a double fell over here, 1 top stitch, and I've got a French seam over here. So on the double fells, I actually take a pair of shears and I cut along what would be the blind seam, which is actually attaching the 2 pieces of material together, not the top stitch. I'll cut along that with a pair of shears, or if you do have a sharp blade and you don't mind scratching your table, you can just literally cut right along that profile right there, cutting the material itself. I don't know if you can actually see that. There we go. Just like that. So I'm going to do that across the whole entire thing. And French seams, you can kind of split like a blind seam. There's a backer material here, keeping some strength into that French seam. But you can literally just take your knife, take your blade, and dive it in between. And cut all that. Or if you're careful enough, like I said, this material is really not that important, but you can get kind of a little too crazy with it sometimes. But you can also take your shears and cut along that seam as well, separating the 2 pieces. And then to show you, that was the French seam there. And then just put the double fell, cutting along the seam that attaches two panels together. I'm going to do the same thing again. Just use my shears to cut right along that seam. So these are all the pieces involved with that bottom bolster. So as you can see, there's 5 pieces all together. So whenever I go and sew this, I'll sew 5 to 4 first, attaching those two together. And then I'll attach number 3 to those 2 pieces. And it's going to obviously progress along this bolster edge here. And then I'll attach this one here. And then this edge piece there. So 2 and 1. So we work backwards from the way we took it apart. Makes sense? What I do at this point here is I'll go ahead and just layer everything on top of each other, biggest piece on the bottom, and then I will just literally roll it into a loose ball here. Put a piece of tape on it. I'll put what exactly it is, so I'll put bottom bolster passenger side, and then I will do this exact same process to the rest of the pieces for the seat. At this point, I'm taking the pieces apart of the back of the seat, which include the back portion and the side bolsters. So considering this seat is symmetrical in itself, I'm actually just going to take these 2 pieces apart and one side bolster apart. And then anything that I do here, I'm basically going to mirror for the other side, other than these alignment marks, because these are not symmetrical side to side. But what I'll do is whenever I'm patterning this, I'll show you what I end up doing, but I'll just take all of the information from this side, flip this whole entire thing, and take that same information for the other side as well. It'll make more sense in the future. This portion here is the bottom portion of the seat, the insert piece. So I'm going to slide the foam out of this, leaving myself with the cover. As you can see, we're on the beauty side here, so I'm going to flip this inside out after I make all my marks so that I can see the salvage and cut it along the salvage line. I'm going to mark this just the same as I did everything else, making my alignment marks. I have a piece of sandwich between 2 pieces. There's a good chance that it's sewn together, which it is beforehand. I know it doesn't make a lot of sense to you now, but it will when I start taking it apart. But this is the seam here, the one that stops here. That seam is actually attaching this back piece to this flap here, so that these 2 pieces are attached before it gets sewn onto this piece. Further instructions will show how exactly that was done. This little section is a little bit different too. As you can see, I still mark my intersection, but the actual intersection lines 2 pieces together, even though it's the point of a 3rd piece. Just want to show you how I marked that. Here's the bottom of that piece that I said had the 2 connecting pieces. It may have made a little bit more sense now to show you how these 2 pieces are linked, but it was underneath of this mirrored seam. So this is without this looking a little bit something like this. So these 2 pieces are linked together before this other piece is attached on top, making sure that alignment actually runs in place of these 2 pieces. Insert for the top, I did the same exact thing on the edge where I went ahead and just marked where it wraps around, and then I'll go ahead and remove that cover. Taking the pieces apart, there's only 3 pieces to this, blowing them up like I have the rest of the actual panels. That just leaves me with the headrest that I've got to deal with next. I'm going to do, once again, the exact same thing that I've shown you the whole entire time. I'm going to mark that profile on the whole entire edge, wrapping all the way down inside of there and out and around this portion as well. And then I'm going to cut on that line, take my cover off, pull the staples, make my alignment marks. Take the whole thing apart afterwards. I made interlude and put some video in of me actually separating some of these pieces and maybe some important marks, but even though it looks complex, it should be just as simple as the rest of the seat. Things may look like they're odd shapes whenever you start separating things. So this is the bend for the headrest, and as you see, when it's separated and I line these 2 pieces up, they are in straight orientation of one another, but these are kind of how they attach, and they look a little bit weird when they're actually unattached from their origin. So where we are now, we have the seat that we did not take apart, and then we have all the patterns that we have taken off the seat, disassembled, and have in each one of their coordinated groups. So I'm going to start by picking the biggest pieces, which is going to be the back, which includes the back of the seat that wraps around for the back bolster on both sides. I'm going to start with that one. So basically what I'm going to do is take this, bring this on a table, put all these aside, put that aside, and I'm going to start patterning this onto our new material. So right now I've got the back laid out. I'm about ready to start patterning. As you can see, I have the good face, the face you see of the material, of the old stuff, opposite from the good face of the new material that I'm going to do. If I copied this whole entire thing right now, I'm making a mirror image of the seat that I have taken apart here. Very, very, very important to know that. Now, for this time being, I have 2 matching seats, but let's say I only had to do one of these seats and the seat itself was not symmetrical. If I patterned this way for this one seat cover, it would be incorrect because I don't need to pattern a mirrored image, I need to pattern the same image. So if I wanted to pattern the same image, it would be good side of material on the same plane, up and down, as the good side of the material. So good side of material down, good side of material down is going to be a copy. When they're opposing, good side material down, good material up, that is going to be a mirrored image. It's a lot easier to make a mirrored image than it is for a copy, for the simple fact that I made all my marks, all my alignment marks that I made across the whole entire thing were all on the face. So I can see those a lot better on here. This way I can utilize a pencil to make my outline instead of a space pin, which is a pin I'll show you guys in the future if you don't know what it is. It's by Fisker. It's a pin that actually writes on the face of material and it's water soluble. It'll disappear afterwards. Those pins are about $5 a piece. Pencils is $5 for 48 pencils or something like that. So I try to do this as much as I possibly can, save some money. Plus I think it lasts a lot longer. Whereas the water soluble pen can maybe get smudged off if it doesn't dry all the way when you rub your arm on it or something. I'm going to make my salvage. Salvage is what's on the back side of the stitch. Is how much we're going to grow this panel so we have material to sew to. So when you get started, use a little ruler like this. My rule of thumb is keeping a 1/2 inch salvage. So I would take this, put it a 1/2 inch from the edge, and then I would draw the perimeter of my old piece a 1/2 inch bigger than what I have written here. Now that's going to be for all the seamed areas. So I have a seam here, I have a seam here, I've got a seam along this edge. On the bottom edge, this is that stapled edge. So I've got the S to add salvage. You can see this is where our staples were. I have noted here that I need to add a 1/2 inch more of salvage. So I would add a 1/2 inch here along this edge as well, keeping that consistent with the cut edge that I have there. If I cut a straight edge, I know that I just need to come a 1/2 inch out from that, and that'll get me the edge that was originally on the seat as well. So I'm going to do that all the way around here, and then I'm going to take all my alignment marks. I guess I'll go over here where I actually have the line drawn, and I'll do a corresponding mark on the new material as well. I'm going to do this for all the pieces. Now, if you remember earlier, I said on the back piece I'm only going to use half of the material, or excuse me, half of the old pattern because it is a symmetrical seat. So I'm going to get all my alignment marks off of this side only, leaving all these alignment marks bare right now. I'm just going to get the perimeter of this side, and then I'll show you how I get those alignment marks to mirror, so I can have this whole entire side patterned, but it also is going to flip-flop and pattern the other side as well. So I have the perimeter marked. I've got the alignment marks marked on one side of this actual material here. I'm going to take this, set this aside. I'm going to cut that perimeter just in the half of the material. And then I'm going to take this, I'm going to fold it over until my alignments line up on the outside of the seat here. And as you can see, it's pretty close, but it's not exactly the same. That's just the error of the seat being in the hot sun for as long as it has been, and or human error of drawing, but it's pretty darn close. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trace my new material as well, and then I'm going to pick the edge of this up, showing where my alignment mark is, and then marking my alignment mark on the outside of this pattern here. Now that I have that all marked, I'm going to open this up, and you can see the faint sketch mark of me patterning the original material, and then a nice broad mark of the mirrored image of this side. So it's not very different. This side's very, very close on the top and the side. But if you notice here at the bottom, it's a little bit off. I'm not concerned about this because I know the piece I'm going to sew on to this side is actually just going to be a mirrored copy of this side. And I know that it is true that the seat itself is symmetrical. Knowing those facts allows me to orient this in the mirrored way, knowing that the cover is going to work. So I'm going to do that the same thing for the other centerpiece. I'm going to mirror it. And then the bolster, I'm going to pattern, and then I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to pattern it again. And I'll show you that process as well. Working with this back cushion, the shoulder piece has a little bit of a bow to it. As you can see, it doesn't quite want to lay flat. So the question is, what do you do about this here? So what I usually do is I get some weight, no matter what it may be. Today it's going to be a bottle of water. And why not use this drill battery as well. So keep the middle of it stationary so it's not going to want to move at all. And then what I like to do is get my edge to lay flat. And then whatever happens here, I've got this little buckle, this little hill here, I'm not worried about. That's just the natural stretch of the vinyl after being outside in the sun for a long, long time. So this is exactly how I'm going to pattern this piece. As though the bow's not even there, and I'm just going to work my edge just like I always do. Alright, here we got a piece of the bolster that I went ahead and patterned. Wanted to notate a couple things. So I have added a 1/2 inch from that sewn edge, not the top stitch, not the white stitch, but where the two panels meet. I've added a 1/2 inch. And why I'm deliberately saying that is because some people get confused on some areas like this, where I have this blind stitch, but then I actually have the edge of the material too. So some people end up, whenever they're starting this out, is they'll add the material onto the edge of the material, and they'll add a 1/2 inch. That's not what you want to do. You want to add it from the stitch mark. So if I grab my little tape measure, you can see that the edge of the material to the mark is wrong. That is wrong. What you want to do is come from where the actual stitches made contact between both panels, and then add your 1/2 inch. So I'm going to come along this pencil line here. And it looks like it's wrong there, but if I lay it flat, you can see that it lays out to be about a 1/2 inch from the edge. Also, while I'm here, never use pin on vinyl or leather, in my opinion. Never use Sharpie on vinyl or leather. I've never seen it actually bleed through leather, but I have seen it where I've had white seats before, and blue ink pen magically likes to appear on the outside of the material, even though you wrote on the back side of the material. So with that being said, what you do want to use is space pens, China markers or wax pencils, and good old pencils. Some pieces, like I've told you before, don't want to lay flat. This one is a nice crinkled up mess. So sometimes you just have to use common sense. So I went ahead and got it stretched out along this little axis, and then I've made all my alignment marks. Now, the assumption is that this line is so close to being straight, it's probably going to be straight. So then I'll actually grab my straight edge, and I'll make that line truly straight. Same with that mark there on this side and this. This should pretty much just be a rectangle with a little finger sticking up. So just use common sense. If it looks like a straight line, good chance it is. If it's a slight arc, you should be able to see it before you took the actual seat apart to realize it is a slight arc and not a straight line. Little better demonstration of that. You can see I've got my drawn little sketch line. I've got my straight line right against it. My alignment marks I'll actually pull all the way to the edge. And then I actually took each one of the points from wherever the line switches angles. I just drew that. So now I'm going to take my straight edge. I'll make that a straight line, make that a straight line, make that a straight line. Sometimes I do things without really thinking about them, so I'm going to kind of show you some of those thoughts that I have now here too. So you see here I've got this nice edge that the seat was cut at. And then I've got this staple mark that doesn't follow parallel of that edge. What I usually do is I'll draw where the staples ended up, and then I'll make a 2-inch line off of the staple line that is parallel to that. It'll make more sense in the future, but basically what I'm going to do is whenever I have this panel flipped over the right way, I'll mark with my space pen on the actual good side of the material where exactly those staples need to fall. And this line here is being parallel with it, makes it easy to judge where those staples need to be whenever the whole piece is flipped right side up. Even though this trick works for some pieces have staples in other places. That doesn't allow that trick to quite work out as well. So just be consistent on copying where those staples kind of hit, and then copy them to the face of the material whenever you flip that piece around, or when it gets sewn onto the piece. It's very important to go and mark on the front side of this one though, because I'm going to be making 2 copies of this. So one like this, one exactly the same way, and then 2 that are mirrored. One copy and one mirror is going to be for the passenger seat. One copy and one mirror is going to be for the driver's seat. Something else I like to do that's unnoticeable whenever I'm actually doing this, I don't even think about it anymore, is sometimes I draw a straight line next to an edge because I don't know if it's a small arc or if it's a straight line. Looking at this one, I can tell you that this is supposed to be a straight line. So when I cut this piece out, I'll cut out on my sketch mark, but I'll make sure that I cut parallel to the straight line that I drawn. Now, if this was a slight arc, I'll basically use this straight line as a reference so that my arc is consistent and doesn't have a weird whoop in the middle of the arc. Something else I want to notate while I'm cutting these pieces out is that like these alignment marks are barely past the edge. So when I cut this, I could see that being a drawn error instead of an alignment mark in the future after I kind of forget what's going on with this. So I'm going to go ahead and darken those past my cut edge so that when I do cut it, I don't lose most of that alignment mark. As I have one side of the bolsters done of the back panel, I'm basically taking the pieces I've already patterned, flipping them over, and I'm going to pattern them again on the new material, using the new pieces as my template, not the old pieces. Whenever you can get away with it, if you don't have a pattern on the actual side of the material that matters, you can orient these to save as much material as possible. So that's what I've done here. Marking the outline of the pieces obviously isn't very hard at all. I usually just take some weights and then put it on there, mark the whole entire perimeter. The thing that isn't as easy to do is marking the alignment marks that are now mirrored on the bottom side. So something I usually do now, just because I do have the experience now, is I'll flip this up, see exactly where that alignment mark meets, and then just mark that on top of it, like that. Least amount of steps. Sometimes you can get away with straight lines if it's going to be a mirrored piece. This here is obviously a straight line. By flipping it over, making sure you're on the straight line there, and then marking your coordinated spots there. Or something I like to do for beginners that I definitely recommend is notching your alignment marks off so that when it is face to face or back to back, then you can actually mark where those alignment marks are with no movement because you notched them out. Now, you're probably asking, well, how did you notch those out? So these are hog ear nippers. They're made to notch the ears of, well, hogs, so you can actually take count of your livestock. These work really good for leather and vinyl, and they actually have notchers made for nothing but material. These have lasted me about 5 years, so I haven't looked for a replacement actually made for this field of work because these have worked so well. Basically all you do, grab your material, put the notcher on it. Do not go past what your sewing tolerance is. On this particular one, I have 1/2 inch tolerance there. And nip it. Boom. But what if you don't have those? Well, you can still do the same thing. What you can do is just a small pair of shears. You just basically pinch to that alignment mark, cut your triangle out. Open that up. Doesn't look too different from the actual notched piece that we did earlier. That helps whenever you're getting started on this. Make sure that if you have a complex piece that you don't actually accidentally move the material side to side if you're trying to do the whole pick up and mark kind of situation. And on big radiuses, I guess small radiuses, acute radiuses, it's a little harder to do that little flip trick too. So definitely recommend that whenever you're starting out. When mirroring pieces that are straight lines, I only just mark the corners, and then I'll just go and use a straight edge to mark my straight lines. Although not critical, it is worth mentioning. Each one of these lines, there's 3 areas you can cut on it. The inside, the outside, and on the line. Definitely not a big difference. Definitely not for a boat seat. But just remember that whenever you are outlining a piece that's already finished, if you were to cut on the outside of that line, it's going to be a fraction bigger than what the old one is. So it's just good practice that whenever you actually do have something that you've copied from a final piece, always try to cut on the inside of the line. What you see now is the whole back cover for one seat all laid out back to back so that I can copy a mirrored one for the other seat. Now this seat itself is symmetrical, so it really doesn't matter that it's back to back or front to front. Because it's symmetrical, the copy is going to work just the same. I have it laid out kind of just how it gets sewn together, but I am going to lay it out accordingly to the material to save as much material as I possibly can before I pattern everything. Once again, because I don't have to make a mirrored image for the other seat, I can just make the same thing all over again. I'm having all of this be face down and face down so I can see all my alignment marks with all of the pieces. And this is with all of them organized and put together so I have as little loss of material as possible. I don't know how well the camera picks this up, but as you can see, I've got everything all patterned again for the second seat. As I was labeling everything, I went ahead and put B's on everything that you see here for one seat. And then as I was taking the patterns off, or the pieces for the first seat, I marked those with an A so I can't get them combined together and get confused on why I have more pieces in one pile than the other. As I'm cutting all these pieces out, I like to separate it from the roll, put that aside, and then just break these down into smaller pieces so I have more control over my cuts comparative to trying to work the huge piece of material that I'm working with too. These are just example pieces, but this is something I want to stress, and I'm going to try to do this undramatically, but it's very important that straight lines are straight and that arced lines are arced. What I mean by that is that our patterns are drawn off of older pieces unless we're making a new pattern. Those are then transferred to material that we are then adding our material tolerance or our salvage to. Then they get cut out, then they get sewn together with all of those steps compounding any issues or errors that we make. So I can't just nonchalantly cut this and say that's good. I mean, you can see that on the edge there on how not straight that is. I also can't go through my curves like this and then cut all these weird little shapes. Even though I may be able to correct that in the end, if I do this at step one, everything's going to compound and make things a lot more issues later down the road. Furthermore, if I'm cutting an inside radius, like I have here, and I just kind of nonchalantly kind of get close to it, I mean, yeah, I could sew that and the characteristic of what that curve may be there, but if I take my time, and with my shears, I cut, and then I drag the point of contact with these two scissor blades, and then I pull again, and then as I'm turning, just like you would with a jigsaw, you turn your blades at the same time, and you get a nice, wickedly smooth curve, and the same with the inside curves. And I know that some of the shears that we use are big, but if you have problems covering into a line, or cutting into a line that has a little bit too tight of a tolerance for your shears, well then you go ahead and get some smaller shears to work that area. But you want to be as consistent as possible, because if you have an error at step one of patterning, it just gets compounded all the way down the line, and then by the time you're actually sewing the pieces together, you could be 1.5 miles off from what you're actually trying to aim to do. When I'm done patterning a piece, I'll go and wind it back up like I did before I start patterning the old pieces, and I actually mark on it what it is and if it's done already. Now that the back's done, you've got the basics of the patterning part done, but as I'm patterning the rest of the seat, I am going to show you little things that I think is noteworthy. As you can see here, I've got a line that kind of goes straight on the old material. But if you look closer at the stitches, I'm adding 1/2 inch to the actual seam line, so make sure to follow that. And as you can see, I kind of continued further than I needed to for both stitch ways. So that leaves me with something that looks unresembled from the factory thing. From the factory piece, that is. But it's important to me that I get 1/2 inch away from the stitch line, not from the piece of pattern that I actually have here in front of me. So the pattern is going to look a little bit different than the piece that I have, and that's okay. On this piece, I've cut along the Sharpie marker that I made that's on the edge of where the material wrapped around a piece, and I use that as a reference point to draw on the material. Now I'm going to add 2 inches for my extra salvage for where I pull and staple on the bottom side of it. So after I have the actual pattern done for the whole top piece of this, I'll take my straight edge, which I know is 2 inches wide, and I'll walk it around that line, making a perfect 2-inch distance from this line, adding 2 inches. Also, with my experience, this arc here is inconsistent. You can kind of see I've got a peak there and a peak there. As I'm cutting this, I'm going to average all that out, so I'm actually cutting a smooth arc. But as you're beginning, probably wouldn't hurt to actually put a straight line somewhere near it, so you can identify those peaks a little bit better, and it may be even better to actually just draw what you have planned to cut before you actually get your blades on there. This piece is going to be a little hard to pattern when you're first beginning, and I mean the reason why is because it's been moved around and manipulated by the heat for so long that it's got some weird things. Like, no matter what I want to do, this piece isn't going to want to lay flat with the rest of the material. So what I'm going to do is make things stationary. That is pretty much a concrete idea and exactly what needs to happen. And then I'm going to kind of force this thing down and average the line between everything. So I'm going to get it where the tension of things wanting to pucker up is about even around the whole entire thing. And I'll hold my hand in this position while drawing around the whole entire profile there, making sure to mark the alignment marks now whenever I actually have it in this circumstance, comparative to letting go and trying to line up the lines later on. This is basically what this area has kind of turned out to be. You can see I've got kind of some area that could fold over on top of each other here, but this is like the salvage area that's getting stapled. So if I need to stretch out with heat to install it, not a problem. Going to focus my energy in getting things as flat as I possibly can around the area that actually gets stitched more than the areas that get stapled around the edge of the seat. The rest of it's pretty straightforward, just patterning it like I would normally would. As I'm sure the camera's going to have a hard time picking up too, you can barely see these alignment marks on the factory material. Well, what I should have done here, especially if you're a beginner too, is I should have marked silver Sharpie on top of the darker colors. That way I wouldn't have missed these, because these alignment marks would be very easy to overlook, but they're very important to us. They are our roadmap. Here's another piece that doesn't want to lay flat. And like I said earlier, the stitch is the more important part. This area gets stapled, this area gets stapled. So I'm going to make sure my stitch area lays flat. And then I'm just going to average the area out in this area here. And if I need to stretch this area for applying the seat cover to the seat, I will. I'm going to point out a flaw that I just did. I had to move my material because of it. As you can see, I've got my Sharpie mark here right next to the staples. This is telling me this is the edge in which the material needs to be brought around 2 inches. And I like to add that 2 inches even though I don't necessarily need it to cover the whole entire seat. But whenever I flip this material upside down, it's easy to get an idea where this line sits because it would be 2 inches away from my new piece of material. So considering the 2 inches that I needed added would have been in my other piece here, I'm just scooting everything over. I'm going to do a little zigzag line here to tell me that this line isn't important, I'm not using it anymore, and I'm going to redraw it a little bit further away from this area. If I'm wanting to pattern something all the way over there, instead of rolling my roll sideways and moving all kinds of things, I'll just slice my material on the lines that I have cut, and I'll bring it towards me, letting the roll overhang a little bit, and then have the piece of material I'm trying to pattern right in there in front of me. Here on this part too, it's very important that I pay attention to my notes. I have plus S here, so plus salvage. I know that this is a drawn Sharpie marker from where it wraps around the edge, so that means I have staples on this other side. So I'm going to give myself 2 inches. I have drawn a rough line right now, but I'll make that a straight edge with my straight ruler, and I'll make sure to add that. If I forgot to add that, realize that when I'm trying to install this, I don't have anywhere to staple because my line would have ended there. Make sure to pay attention to your notes. Make sure you're making your notes. I'm working on the insert for the bottom now, and our sides consist of 2 different pieces because it's 2 different materials. Well, on the seat that I haven't quite taken apart just yet, you'll see why exactly they chose to do that. It's because the insert color is going to be different than the front of this. Well, we're doing a little bit different patterning on this seat, so we're going to leave these 2 pieces together and do it in solid red, because both of these pieces are going to be in solid red. We are going to do a diamond of some kind on here, but there's no need for the separation of 2 different patterns there. So we're going to keep those 2 pieces together, which are equivalent to these 2 pieces, and I'm going to pattern it as though it's just 1 piece. So this pattern may look a little bit confusing, but I'm hoping to break it down for you. This is also a moment where I gotta say the generic thing as do as I say, not as I do. I started to draw my diamonds, which consist of 2 triangles. The first ones I drew were 2 inches by 4 inches out of pencil, and I just felt as though it was too small for this whole array. So I ended up changing my distance from 2 inches to 3 inches, and to double that, the 4 inches to 6 inches. So our diamonds that we're going to be using for this pattern is going to be 3 inches by 6 inches. To get the whole entire pattern, all I really did was just draw a center line down the middle of this, and then I teed it with a carpenter square, and then I drew alignment marks every 6 inches on this axis, and then alignment marks every 3 inches on this one. After I drew that tee, I noticed I didn't have too much alignment marks to make the whole entire pattern, so I ended up drawing another 90-degree line there, marking 3 inches away as well. Then, using a straight edge, I aligned all the alignment points across the whole entire thing. And then where I didn't have alignment points on that line, I just made sure that my carpenter square, when I was drawing my line, was completely parallel with the last line that I drew. And I did that both directions. I think the amateur thinking of this is going to be is, okay, go ahead and pattern this over to new material and sew on top of it. We're not going to do that. when you're doing diamonds or something that has a bunch of top stitching like this, what actually happens is your material with the foam on it kind of shrinks in a little bit. So what I'll do is I'll make a rectangle a little bit bigger than this, probably an inch bigger than my actual pattern I have made here. And then I'll make my diamond passes on the whole entire thing. After that, I'll then take this, plop it on top, then I will draw the outline. If I took all the stitches out afterwards and lay the material out, my pattern that I would cut out would be actually bigger than what my pattern is here. Because that foam brings in together each one of those seams and shrinks that whole entire piece of material. At this point, I have my pattern on top of the face of the material. Now, pencil won't really quite draw on the top of this, and I'm going to be making lines across the whole entire thing that you're not going to be able to clean the pencil off of easily. So whenever I'm drawing on the face of this thing, I'm actually going to be using my space pen, which you've probably heard me talk a little bit about. See if I can bring that into focus there. But Fisher Space Pen Silver Ink. It allows you to draw on rubbers and vinyls, and then it's all water soluble, so it comes off fairly easy. At the same time, you still don't want to leave this on the material for more than maybe a couple of days, because it does get harder to come off. It still will come off, but sometimes it's a little bit more than easy to get it quite off the material. So what I'm going to do is put my material as evenly as I possibly can side to side of this thing, and then I'm going to mark the continuous lines all the way across this whole entire thing. Take this aside and use my straight edge to finish the lines across the whole thing. So I went ahead and marked my edges like I told you, and then straighten all my lines out. So now that's the piece of material that I have, and I've got a twin for it too. It's ready for foam, and we'll continue on. So the foam I'm using is called scrim foam, also known as sew foam. Today I'm using 1/2 inch. I also have 1/4 inch. 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch are my go-tos with scrim foam. The reason why I'm using 1/2 inch is because when I actually seam through all these lines, I want as much depth as I possibly can, and having the 1/2 inch instead of the 1/4 inch is going to give me more depth. So I'm just going to use contact adhesive from the back side of these. It's a forever ongoing debate about if you should glue like top sewn pleats or sewn diamonds and patterns, if you should glue them or you just sew around the perimeter and sew the lines. I've just known to gluing them down being tried and true for me. I haven't run into any problems with doing that, so I'm not going to stop doing what I know works. So I'm going to go and glue this down. Well-known glue in the industry is the Wellwood contact adhesive for land-out tops and trim. It's what I'm going to be using to glue this down today too. I'm just using a generic spray gun from Harbor Freight. I think this is like 30 bucks. I don't worry about cleaning these out. If I know I'm just going to not use it for a little bit, air leak hole, I'll cover it with some tape and let it sit. And then also, if you get done using this, I always try to make sure that the glue isn't less than half full so that it doesn't harden in there. I'm just going to roughly cut around this, just using nothing but a razor blade. I'm going to cut about 1/2 inch around all of this stuff, and then we're going to bring it to the sewing machine. So before I start sewing on my actual pieces that I have, I'm going to do some test runs and see exactly what kind of spacing I want. Spacing in both the stitches, so the stitch length between one to the other, and how exactly I want to ride my drawn line on the surface on both sides, because I'm going to be doing some diamond stitches, but they're going to be, each line is going to be double stitched. So as you can see, I've got all kinds of different spacing, and I got all those different spacings using different alignment points on my actual foot here. So I'll go to a bare line here, show you what I mean by that. So I've got this drawn line right here. For my first stitch, I could put that line in this little crevice. I could put that line over here on this side, making the distance from the line to the stitch further away. I could put the line over here between the pressure foot and walking foot on this side. Or I could put it over here right beside the guide. I could put it on the guide. I could put it on the outside of the guide. So I've got all these different choices I can use to run my stitch parallel to the line that I have drawn. I've chose to do two different ways. My first pass, I'm going to actually go between the pressure foot and the walking foot. So I'm actually going to put this line directly in the middle of those two. I'm looking through the camera right now instead of looking at the actual material, so my line may not be straight. 2 stitches forward, 2 stitch back, 2 stitch forward, 2 stitch back. That's a locking stitch so that my thread doesn't come unwound real easy after the stitch is done. And then I'm going to continue see if I can hold my camera here. I'm going to continue by putting that space pin mark right between that walking foot and pressure foot. Now, human error is a thing. I'm going to lock stitch to the back side too. 2 forward, 2 back, 2 forward, 2 back. Human error is a thing, so my spacing's pretty decent until I get to the end here. You can see it got a lot closer to my edge. So instead of using that space pin mark lined up at the same area to give me parallel for the space pin, what I'm going to use now is the actual stitch itself as the guide instead of the pin mark. So I'm going to put the stitching on the outside of the walking foot, of the pressure foot, just like so. And I'm actually going to be using the thread itself as my guide to the outside of this instead of using the space pin. What that's going to allow me to do is that any mistakes I made in my first pass, I'm not going to make more dramatic looking with the mistakes because I'm following this line. I'm following my mistaked line, just with the human error itself. So now the second pass, lock stitch, and then I'm going to actually ride the outside of that pressure foot on the stitch, not paying attention to the space pin line. Okay, then a lock stitch to the end. So as you can see, my 2 lines aren't intersecting that space pin perfectly, but the 2 stitch lines that are on both sides of the space pin are evenly spaced and parallel through the whole thing. So it's a little bit more dramatic because I got off there because I'm trying to pay attention to the camera more than I am for what I'm actually doing in front of me. But as I'm stitching the whole entire thing, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I've got my line in the middle. The first pass on one side of the diamond I'm going to do with the pressure foot and walking foot on the side of the pin, like so. And then the second pass, I'm actually going to put that first stitch that I made on the opposite side of the pressure foot and have that stitch be my guide instead of the space pin on the second half. Before I start stitching my diamonds, what I am going to do is just fish this material underneath, and I'm just going to stitch the perimeter of the vinyl to the foam. Back stitching as I go. Notice I'm kind of pushing the foam down as it's going into the machine. It just helps to make the stitch length consistent and helps the machine from binding up. As you're beginning and stuff, you're going to be a little bit more uncomfortable with getting your fingers next to that, as you should be. I mean, it is a very, very hefty industrial machine that can sew through my fingertip pretty easily. So probably better when you're starting out with sew foam, just to keep your fingers away from it. Don't push down like I'm doing here. Notice as I pivot, I'm going to make sure my needle is put all the way down by hand cranking the machine, lifting up with my knee, and then putting it back down. Double stitching at the end. I wouldn't normally do my locking stitch on this, but just with you guys watching, I think it's probably better for me to do that. Then you end up with the perimeter all stitched. What that's going to allow to happen is that if I end up stitching this whole entire line, the material wants to let go of the glue for whatever reason, the material is not going to move much on the foam, distorting the diamonds. At this point, it's more important for me to not screw up the material as much as it is to get this video feed here. So I'm going to show you how I start this. Notice I just did my lock stitch. I'm using this solenoid here, but how most people do this on a traditional machine is putting this down to put the machine in reverse. But I'm going to go ahead and continue my line. I'm going to do all of my first pass for all these diamonds now. But basically I'm going to lock stitch, straight line stitch, using that space pin between the pressure foot and walking foot, and then lock stitch at the very end as well. So I've got one stitch on one side of the diamonds completely done for the whole panel. Something I want to mention that some people don't really talk about too much is that when you're doing line work with the lines drawn on top of the actual panel and you're using something for an alignment mark, make sure to try to keep your head in the same space while you're going down that line, because believe it or not, swaying your head right and left is going to give you a different orientation to have that guide mark go through the actual foot, causing your line to kind of vary a little bit. So try to keep your head locked in the same position while you're doing these straight lines. The best way to do these is using a quilting machine and let it automatically do it using a CNC software. Second best would be using a double needle machine. Well, I'm not using a double needle machine. For one, we don't have one currently, and then for two, a lot of people starting out is not going to have a double needle machine. I'm going to point out some flaws that I see in this. I'll tell you exactly what the difference is between a double needle and a single needle using a double line. For one, even though your lines look pretty symmetrical, when you get down to the side here, you can see that they're not super symmetrical. You can see I got a little bit of a little sway right there. And then on top of that, we're using 1/2-inch scrim foam, which is pretty thick. So what happens is that the walking foot and pressure foot drag a little bit. Let me see if I can focus in. Drag a little bit on the first one, on the first pass. And it drags a little bit less on the second pass because the foam's already compressed pretty close to where the walking foot's going. So if you really pay attention to this line, you can actually see that on the right-hand side, my stitches are closer together than they are on the left-hand side, and nothing about the machine has changed. The only thing that's changed is the resistance of the material going down into the machine. Now, if I take a more focused approach and push down the foam on both sides of the line as I continue the material through, it would probably alleviate a lot of that. But also pushing down the foam is going to move my line a little bit right to left, so I have a better chance of my line looking a little bit more curvy. So I just take the hit and I'll allow my needle stitch to be a little bit different side to side. No one's really going to notice it until they're working in this industry or actually behind the machine themselves. And I just let that just be kind of a flaw with being able to get this done with a single needle instead of trying to have the expense of a double needle to do these kind of jobs. I've ran into a perfectly frustrating issue that you guys are going to fall into too. I have stitched this whole entire second line and my bobbin has ran out. So now all I've done is basically punch holes in this thing. So now what I got to do is I'm going to go ahead and restring a bobbin. Somehow I ran out at the end of this stitch, so I don't have anything that started at all in this one. So I basically just manually have to go through. When you're just beginning, I would just do the painstakingly task of just using your hand, bringing the needle down towards the material until you see it literally punch the hole from the bottom side of the foot, and then punch it, and then drag it, and keep on going. Pay attention, unlike me, so that whenever this happens, you only have 2 or 3 inches to do, not a whole entire stitch line. So inspecting this really close, you can see that I've missed a couple of holes, but when you actually look at the whole entire thing, you're not going to notice that. Not too worried about it. If you are worried about it, if it's a high stress area or something you know somebody's going to see, just remake the whole new piece. But this is a boat seat. I'm not concerned about it for this particular job, but it is something to notate. For the most part, all the other ones fell in place. There's another one right there that I missed. Here's another good example of running out of a bobbin and what to do. So here I've ran out of bobbin and I once again completed my line before noticing. So I need to do a better job of paying attention to that. But I'm going to show you how exactly I continue this line so I don't have to just redo this whole entire piece. You're going to start by flipping the piece of material over, pulling where the bobbin ran out, pulling the front side thread through to the back side of the material. Give this thing a chance to autofocus there. It's kind of hard to see because my top thread is white. My bobbin thread right now is currently gray. So I'm going to pull back a couple of stitches so that my gray thread, my bobbin thread, is long enough that I can actually tighten it. Then what I'm going to do is I'm just literally going to double knot it. I'm going to cut a little bit of my white thread off so that I don't have 16 inches of it hanging off. I want about 4 inches, ideally. I've done this well enough that short thread isn't too big of a deal to tie. So I just knotted it once there. I put a slight tension on it against the actual foam there. And then I'm going to double knot it again. Before I tighten it, I'm going to pay attention to the divot that the bobbin creates with the tension of the thread. And I'm going to try to manipulate this first knot enough that the tension matches what that looks like. And then I'll tighten my second knot onto it. So I'm holding my second knot high. Then I'm pulling
I know it's kind of hard to see, I'm sorry about that, but I'm pulling that first knot, and whenever it's tight as I wanted it to get, oh, my second knot fell out. Sometimes if it's too short, you can take a right angle pick and help maneuver that thread through. So once again, tighten the bottom knot and tighten the second knot on top of it. As you can see, it's still kind of loose, and I'm just going to pull with a decent amount of force until that knot, the tension of that knot brings the thread down about the same as what the bobbin normally does before it runs out. So that's 2 knots. I like to put 2 more knots on top of it, making sure that tension doesn't go anywhere. The struggle's kind of nice to see, so you guys can see how you do it if the thread's too short. But I just use a right angle pick, bring it right around. There's knot number 3. There's knot number 4. I usually cut this about 3/4 inch away from the edge. Sometimes I do this, sometimes I don't. I should probably get in the habit of doing it. But if you just end up just hitting a little heat on the edge of the thread, let it go back a little bit. And then make sure to put it out with your fingertip. My hands are pretty callous, so I'm not worried about burning myself. It balls the end of the material, so if it does loosen a little bit, it has a harder time of becoming untied. That'll leave you with a very good stopping point of where the thread stops. And that's initially where we're going to put our needle at with some extra thread hanging out to continue that stitch on. I'm going to make sure that my bobbin has about, I don't know, 10, 12 inches of extra thread sticking out. Same with the top thread. I'm going to position the material underneath of it like I'm going to continue the stitch. I'm going to put tension on both the thread underneath the machine and the thread above the machine. I'm going to put some tension on it because the machine's going to want to put the tension on the thread, and it could pull it and bind up underneath the bobbin, so you want to put some downward pressure on it so that doesn't happen. Now, using my thigh, I'm going to keep this up. I'm going to dive that needle right into the same hole that I stopped and tied off the knot at. Just like that, right through that same hole. Then make sure your foot is down before you start stitching, but very carefully. I'm going to stitch through those same holes, still holding the tension on my thread until I get about 4 or 5 threads deep. After about 4 or 5 threads deep, then I'm free. The tension is going to stay from the thread and resistance of the material itself. And then I'm going to just continue my stitch as careful as I possibly can be to try to hit those holes. I missed a little bit there. Going back up a little bit. Looks like I missed a little bit there. You can see that there. That one there. And then I'm back up top to where I initially put that new bobbin in. So I'm going to do the exact same thing that I did to finish off that thread beforehand. I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to pick that piece of thread up, pull the top thread through. So pull it tight. Second one, you see my knot's loose. I'm going to pull it until it shows about the same amount of tension as the bobbin does by itself naturally. And then I'm going to knot it 2 more times. Trimming it to 3/4 of an inch or so. And then just being very careful to burn just what I need to keep that thread from unraveling. So there it is where my finger is. I'll try to flop it over and show you exactly what it does look like on the front side. As you can see, it's really hard to tell where that was. A trained eye can tell where it is because the divot that is created is a little bit wider than the rest of them. I know you probably can't see that on camera, but in person you can kind of tell a little bit more. But that's less of a notice than if you rush through it and don't hit your holes on spot on. Maneuvering the material a little bit, you can make those holes disappear, and putting a little heat on it will relax the material from the stress of the needle going through it, and those holes will get even smaller too. So I'm really not concerned about those. Those are a little bit further away than what I'd like to get away with, but because this is a boat seat and as much work as there's actually done in this seat, you're not really going to notice that. To point out the flaw though, it's right there. So until you get probably about there and really pay attention to it, you're not really going to see it. And no one's going to pay that kind of attention to these seats. Not in boat seats. Point, both of them are done, and now I'm just going to go and clean off the lines that I don't need anymore with some leather and vinyl cleaner. I can see what they actually look like, even though some lines didn't seem too parallel with the space pin on it. When you clean all the space pin off, everything cleans up and it looks pretty darn nice. So now what I'm going to do is put my old pattern on that I used to get all my diamonds, and I'm going to go ahead and pattern the outside of that. And then we're going to sew around the outside of that, staying within the bounds of our tolerance of salvage. And then we're going to cut out on that seam. And it's probably a good time to show you too about how much things shrunk. So you can see the lines for these diamonds are pretty close to splitting. And pretty close to splitting right there in the middle. So ideally these lines would line up in the middle of that thing. And you can see it's about a 1/4 inch off there, and evenly 1/4 inch off there. Once again, lining up. 1/4 inch off there. So if we would have just went ahead and made this pattern before stitching the diamonds on it, the whole thing would have been shrunk in about a 1/4 inch. Would have been mission critical? Probably not. But I just try to do things the same way every single time, and I know that things like this shrink, so I went ahead and did it this way because I'm used to that. I'm trying to point out more of my natural flaws than I normally would in videos like this because they're really good training points. I kind of did myself a disservice by not giving myself enough room here whenever I did my initial ones. That when I'm drawing my lines to outline my pattern now, it kind of gets mixed in with the stitch that's already there, so it's going to be a little harder for me to notice where things are. So don't be as frugal as I was here in this point here, and give yourself a little bit more breathe room so that when you do your final pass around the perimeter of this thing, you have a little bit more defined lines than what I've gave myself here. Headlamps like this, or the one with the center light too, can really help you in some scenarios where things are a little harder to see. That area between the silver pin and the white stitch that's kind of harder to see when I have my headlamp turned off. I guess it's a little easier to see through the camera than it is in person. But obviously shining light on the situation gives you a little bit more of a guideline than without those headlamps. Some machines, if not all machines, have lights on them to help you guide that situation as well, but additional light has only helped me in the past as well. Doing top stitch patterns like this, whenever I get the perimeter of it all mapped out, what I like to do is just go around with a stitch through the perimeter. But I do this a little bit barbarically. I do it a little bit barbarically, but what I end up doing is holding the solenoid with one finger, and as I'm going around the whole perimeter, anytime I pass the stitch, I will safety stitch on top of it, because I'm going to cut through the stitch that I'm stitching past right now. I'm going to cut on that silver mark whenever all said and done. So the safety stitch we did in the beginning is no longer doing its job. So safety stitching on top of it this direction will hopefully bind that thread down enough so that it's not going to move until we get our next piece of material over that edge. I figured I'd show you what it looks like in real time going around the perimeter, lock stitching it past each one of the diamond stitches. Definitely don't recommend going at this speed when you're first learning. As you can see, I'm using my solenoid. A lot of machines don't have that. They just use this one. So I'll use that as well for a demonstration. Mechanically, the machine's doing the exact same thing, just one's doing it manually with the crank and the other one's using an electronic solenoid. I've been overanalyzing the things that I'm doing here because I want to train you guys in the best way so you can be better than me at the stage of life that I am right now. So sitting here thinking about this is something I've never done, but I'm definitely going to recommend doing. So I usually go ahead and cut out the piece of material this time. And our safety lock stitch is what's holding the thread for the diamond stitches in place currently. If they get jostled around a lot, sometimes those threads can actually come loose though. So what I'm going to recommend to you guys is, if you get a pattern like this, leave it at this stage. Don't cut the perimeter, but I went ahead and sewn the perimeter. I just need to cut the silver line so that I'm ready to actually stitch this onto more pieces of material. But go and keep it like this instead of like this, so that if it gets jostled around, it's going to be a little bit of time before you actually sew it onto the rest of the pieces of the seat. You're not going to have to be worried or tempted to do anything extra with these stitches, because they're not going to come loose, because they're not going to sit loose until you're ready to put it back on the machine again. So with that being said, I'm going to keep this other one just like this, set these aside, and work on my next pieces. In front of me I have the old pieces compared to the new pieces. This foam has kind of deteriorated with time, so we want a little bit thicker on that foam. This also is foamed, so I'm going to do the same thing with this. Instead of using the 1/2 inch for this, I don't have any details I really want to point out thickness wise like I did with these diamonds, so I'm just going to use 1/4 inch for this piece instead of the 1/2 inch that I used up here. So now I have the pieces on top of the scrim foam, 1/4 inch instead of 1/2 inch this time. As you can see, I've outlined them using nothing but a China marker or a wax pencil, just to give me a layout so that whenever I remove these, I know exactly where I need to lay my spray adhesive without going a little bit further than what I need to. For the diamonds, I use the contact adhesive that you normally see, the Landau from DAP. This time I'm actually going to be using some Stinger spray adhesive. Generically in the upholstery world, it's called foam adhesive. This is just going to give me a nice tack between the foam and the back of the material. As I said earlier, there's kind of a discussion about, if you should go ahead and put adhesive down for diamonds and top sewn pleats and things of that nature. I should go ahead and say that I would never do this with leather. I would only do this with vinyl. Leather you can manipulate with heat at the end, and if you try to do the manipulation with a glue between the actual foam and the leather itself, it's going to distort and do some funny things. You want that free motion whenever it comes to leather. Vinyl, on the other hand, you still can manipulate it, but it's not exactly the same, and I like to bond those two surfaces together. With this adhesive, you want to wait till it's pretty much dry, not tacky at all, before you actually bond the two surfaces together. Whereas to this stuff, you want to make sure that the actual aerosol is out of the air, but it's going to be tacky and stay tacky forever. So that is actually when you apply your stuff. You just want to give it maybe, 30 seconds for the aerosol to actually leave the glue. As I mentioned, doing the diamonds, I use razor blades to cut the foam. Sometimes I'll use my scissors, or my shears that is, but I only use my shears whenever it's contact adhesive from DAP. I never use my shears when it's this tacky stuff. And the reason why is, well, it stays tacky. So if I cut this with my shears are going to get real nasty. I'm going to have to clean them more often. So I just rather opt out for the shears and use a razor blade instead. I conserve more of my good material too. The material on the back side here, no one's ever going to see. So I'm not going to use my good red material for that. I'm going to use something that I still have from a prior job that is a dark gray or black, or something that's going to mix in with the shadows just in case it peeks out a little bit. And that's what I'm going to do the bottom of this thing in. Bottom of the insert that you don't see, you may remember this from earlier. It had a wing just like this on the other side that we went ahead and took off. As you can see, this one's already attached, and there's another pair of stitches right here where it's unattached. Well, what they did is they went ahead and sewed this tab onto this piece before attaching it to the rest of the seat cushion. The stitch here that's been removed is what I actually attach it to the other pieces to the seat cushion. So I'm essentially going to do the exact same thing here. I'm going to go ahead, I've got my copy of this piece right here and the copy of the wing. I'm going to go ahead and attach that with a 1/4 inch inseam, just kind of like how they did here, making sure to stay within the tolerance of what the final seam's going to be, attaching the rest of the pieces to the seat cushion. So I have both of those sewn on now for both seat covers. And the line that I drew to wrap around the seat for my extra salvage, I told you I added 2 inches. And the reason why I do 2 inches is because it's really easy to transfer that line to the face, which is what's really going to be important, by using a 2-inch straight edge, putting on the edge of the material, and then transferring that line with a space pin that can wash off at the end. So considering I added 2 inches, I know that that line is right on top of the other one. I'm at the point now that I want to sew these two pieces together. I want to talk about a couple different things that I look at before sewing two arches together like this. It doesn't matter if it's a real tight arch like this or a really narrow or very short arch. I kind of do the same exact thing. I always keep the concave on bottom and the convex on top. putting it good side to good side. Now the reason why I do that is because when I have these on top of each other, you can see all the alignment marks coming your way, and it's a lot easier to predict what's going to happen. If I had this the opposite direction, if I had the convex on bottom, concave on top, aligning the alignment marks, you cover what's coming up in the future. So it's a little harder to predict how much to pull one compared to the other so that your alignment marks line up. You gotta bear with me with this video sometimes. I am a trimmer before I am a video recorder / producer. So I've got my edges lined up here. Got my first alignment mark lined up, as I hope you can see pretty decently. As you can see, I have the overhang over here. Now, if I did my measuring and patterning correctly, this should be a perfect 1/2 inch. This tip of this 1/2 inch should be right on the edge of this material. So if I start there, if I did my patterning correctly, then my alignment mark should hit perfectly. Just like I do with every seam, I'm gonna go ahead and do my safety stitch. Okay, that's anchored down. The two pieces are now connected already. Okay, so as you can see, this bottom notch is towards me a lot closer than this top notch is, but I can yank that and bring it right in line. Now, experience is going to give you the knowledge of how much you can and cannot compress material for what you can and cannot see on the top side. But sadly enough, I believe that that's just going to come in time. So the best recommendation I can give you, I guess, is if the bottom one pops up more than 1/4 inch, you probably can't push in on it any more than you think than that allows. And then if you have to put, if you're pinching somebody's cheek, you can probably put the same amount of pressure on that before it starts to hurt on their cheek as you can with the material. If your fingers start slipping with that tension, you probably can't stretch more than that without you going to be able to see the tension between the two pieces of material have an opposite tension. So continuing on, I'm going to put my left hand on bottom here, my right hand on top. I'm going to manipulate the material as I'm going through this thing, getting my alignment marks to line up as I go throughout. With the addition of salvage and the convex and concave side of things, the addition of material makes it look like the material's not going to line up. As you can see, the second one looks a little bit further off, the third one looks even further off, and that's just because the addition of the 1/2 inch. Considering our pivot point is actually going to be a 1/2 inch in and not the edge of the material, it will line up as I continue forward here. So I'm paying attention to my alignment marks, and I'm also paying attention to my piece of tape that I have on the machine that marks my 1/2 inch away from the needle edge. So that 1/2 inch right there distance makes up the salvage that I've added to the stitch itself. So as you can see right here, this looks like it's a 1/2 inch in front of this one. But as the initial curve of the material comes together, those will align. So I'm paying attention to 3 things here. Where this material edge starts and stops there, same with this one here, my alignment marks, and the amount of pressure that I'm putting on the material, stretching the material. And then once again, if my patterning was done correctly, and I paid attention to what I was doing alignment mark wise, the end mark should be just as flat and near the edge as I began with. As you can see, it's probably about an 1/8 inch off. It's definitely not perfect compared to my starting point. That does give us the two pieces put together though. You can see some wrinkles there. It's because of the tension of both the foam and the convexness of this material. I'm going to put some relief cuts in this, relieving that tension and that extra material there, allowing it to lay flatter. On the 1/4 inch scrim foam, you can see I have relief cuts all along the edge of this now here, and it just releases all that tension from this material trying to push it this way. Now don't get me wrong, you see it's got some flex in it. Part of that is because of the domeness of the seat it actually goes onto, and the other part of it is just because there's just so much bulk there. So it looks a little crazy right now, but we're going to put a face seam on it here, taking both pieces of this salvage, the pink from this and the blue from this, laying it down this direction, putting another stitch in it, kind of putting things in place even though it doesn't 100% want to be there naturally. I'm going to do my best to record this part for you too, but I'm getting ready to do my top stitch, which is considered a double fell here. And I'm using my guided foot here to put right there, so that guide right there is going to ride right in the crease where both pieces are sewn together, where the blind stitch is. And I want to make sure that all my salvage, both for the bottom piece and this piece, are over going underneath that stitch. So I'm going to basically just make sure it goes right along there throughout the whole way. And then I'm going to go ahead and double stitch at the beginning, double stitch at the end. Excuse me, safety stitch at the beginning, safety stitch at the end. See if I can get this positioned in a way that you're going to be able to catch this. I'm making sure to lay everything flat so there's not a bulk in a weird place or anything like that. I'm putting tissue both in this piece and this piece. When I put my hand underneath there, I'm just making sure all the salvage for both pieces are pushed underneath the stitch. I'm gonna have to move the camera. This may be an odd angle. We'll see what happens here. Putting just a little bit of outward tension on it as well. Coming close to the end here now. I'm at the end now, so I'm going to do my safety stitch again. Back 2, forward 2, back 2, forward 2. So now you can see there were some creases here. Those have kind of been alleviated. And when this gets popped out the right direction, it's going to even be alleviated even more. So you can see the back side captured both of the salvages of both of those seats as well, and it lays a little bit more flat now. So now you can see here, this edge of the top side of the material doesn't quite match that edge over there. Same on this side. That could be a little bit of a flaw in my patterning. It could be the thickness of this material making things not line up as well as it was. But basically we're just going to average that out when we sew the piece on that goes on top of this. We're just going to act like it's a straight continuous line and continue our stitch all the way through in a straight manner. These two pieces here may show a little bit better representation on what I mean by sometimes these alignment marks don't look like they line up until you start sewing things. You know, when you put it edge to edge, it really looks like these aren't going to line up together. But I'll show you that's not the case when we start sewing things. So if I did my job correctly, I should be able to line it up edge to edge of the material. And my first alignment mark should be pretty darn close. You can see that alignment mark hit. This one's pretty darn close. When I get around the radius, it should line up. Same with this next one. Same with the next one. Same with the next one. And you can see I'm at the end of the actual rope there. We're going to go ahead and do our safety stitch. And that piece is on. What else that's really good to mention too at this point too is that you can see here where it's stitched together. If I pull a little tension on there, you can see the little dots of thread. I used white thread for this, and if I want those little dots to disappear even further than what they already are from the tension of the thread, then I could use red thread obviously, but generically I'd probably use black thread. And the reason why is because on board I have these bigger spools of thread, and I try to keep those in white, tan, gray, and black. I think gray would be a decent one as well, but I mean, black's mixed in with the shadows a lot better, so I would go black on this one. So here I have this kind of hook-shaped piece that I've got attached to this straight line, so the question is, which one goes on top? Well, if I put this one on top, I can see what my future's got to hold for me. If I flip-flop it and start on this opposite end, like this, I can't see that bottom piece because of the way it hooks around. So it just makes more sense, once again, to keep the convex piece on top. I know this isn't concave, but it is a straight line, so it is more concaved than this convex piece that's going into the actual machine. Remember when I mentioned that these didn't line up, that I'm just going to kind of make that a straight line? This is what I mean. Currently, my edge of the material is on the edge of the material as I've been sewing this whole piece on. Well, now what I'm going to do is that whenever I hit this alignment mark, this V mark to that V mark, that V mark to that V mark, I'm going to basically pay attention to what the line wants to do to get this alignment mark over there. As you can see, it kind of floats over this edge a little bit, and that's okay. It's going to give me my straight line, bringing me from this straight edge to this straight edge, negating that step right there. I definitely don't want to like bring it straight there and then come over a 90-degree angle, keep on coming. That's going to look unnatural, obviously. You notice how it just kind of stepped and like sat there for a second just then? What happened is the foot had a trouble walking through all of this material here. So what I could have done there, if I wasn't paying attention to the camera so much, is I could have actually kind of gave this a little bit more of a push in that area when I seen it was struggling to release some of that tension that it had there. I'm at a point now where this material overlaps, and I could have it where the salvage sat this direction, or I could flip the salvage around and flip it that way. Knowing on how this looks on the seat, this piece is going to be the face of the bottom bolster, and this is on the bottom of the seat. So if I had it like this, it's going to put a weird edge on the bottom of the seat, whereas too, if I have it this way, the whole face shows nice and clean. So I'm going to fold the salvage that direction, and then keep on sewing. And then I have alignment marks here that I didn't transfer to the face. That's fine. This is usually how I do it. I just look on the bottom, look up top, and then put the pieces together. As you're starting out, I definitely would recommend notching the material out though. Trying to stay out of the shot at the same time I'm sewing this, but what I would normally do is I'd go real slow, put just my fingertip on this, go stitch by stitch, and get that all the way to the end of the material. So this is that area that had that step, but if I flip this material right side out, you'll see you no longer see that step. It's nothing but a straight line. I know it looks a little wonky right now. It's kind of hard to do everything with one hand, but it appears as a straight line. So when you come up to a peak, kind of like this one here, where I have to sew something onto this side of the material and also sew something to this side of the material, the question is, how do I finish that edge? So I could bring my 1/2-inch salvage and keep on stitching on this pencil line I'm drawing here, but that doesn't leave me a 1/2-inch salvage here. So I could leave myself a 1/2-inch salvage there by doing a stitch kind of to the same degree of this new pencil line here, which gives me a 1/2 inch on this other side. I'm not going to do either one of those things. I'm going to imagine, and maybe it'll help you draw it whenever you're just starting out too, that I'm going to do a 1/2 inch here, and then also just draw your 1/2 inch on the other side, and then split that difference with your stitch. So I'm going to run my stitch right on this edge, and then when I get to this point here, I'll continue out on that straight edge there. See if I can't demonstrate that. I know my finger's probably in the way. Let me see if I can't use a pencil to hold my material in place here too. So the 1/2 inch is running on my tape here. The edge is running on the tape still. And then my needle, I've got to worry about my needle hitting this point, not the front of the foot. So the needle's over here. So I'm going to go 1 more stitch, maybe 2 more stitches to get to that area there. So 1, 2. And then instead of continuing straight in that area that I have there, I'm going to still keep that on the edge there. But I'm actually going to go ride this straight line right there. That middle line, breaking between those two. So what does that do for me? Well, what it allows is that whenever you fold this material down, it's going to be pretty close to being flat with this edge. Whereas too, if I would have continued with that 1/2 inch gap there, instead of breaking it down like that, what I'd end up would be this. So if I add 1/2 inch salvage here and sew on a new piece, there's a chance that a little white's going to be poking out there. Whereas too, if I'm sewing in a 1/2 inch over here, you can see I've got plenty of meat right here that I'm already covering up, because that 1/2 inch is going to end up to be about right here. So it allows those little corner areas, like right here, if I had material that went along this whole entire edge, to not allow this first piece I sewed on to poke through and show the back side of this material just a little bit. Sometimes sewing pieces together, it's not really straightforward which one needs to be on top and what needs to be on bottom, and the job can get done both ways. It's just what is going to be easier. So the question here is, do I start in this corner with the red piece on top, or do I flip everything upside down and start with the gray piece on top, making my alignment marks together? And for this instance, I think it's always easier to start with some solid foundation. So it's a lot easier to start here because everything's already laying flat already. So that's what I'm going to do, is just start there, keep on going. And it seems like it gets a little bit more complex here because of this angle here. But this is vinyl, it's got some give. So I can literally lay this down almost flat, as you can see here. So when it gets over here, stretch the material out, as long as my alignment marks line up fine, it's pretty flat. It's a lot easier to do this direction than it would be with a gray top. So this is that piece all sewn together, which is the bottom insert piece. I basically just copied what they did. I would have done things a little bit differently, but I decided it was best just to do how I would have done this as a beginner too. So I just copied what they did as well, with adding the flap for the staple lines. Obviously this is another piece of material here that's a little bit different than this. You don't see any of this. This is nothing but a tie down listing. So I did the same. Use a material that's not so important, that's still marine grade quality, and just sewn that on there as well. Now I've got the piece of foam in it, and as you can see, it doesn't look fantastic, and it's not going to until it's actually put on the seat. But you see all these little wrinkles here? This is all because the salvage, the backside of the stitch, is laying one way and then the other way, and then flip-flop, and anywhere that you see like a transition like that, it's because it's all kind of flopped 2 different directions. So I'm going to see if I can't post this up so that you can see me working this stuff. I'm just putting my hand between the foam and the material, and I'm moving all that salvage to the top side. So it's worked on the inside, I'm going to work it from the outside. Some of these things are just really hard to get on camera. And as you can see how that's a little more relaxed. And when it gets wrapped around the whole entire seat base, it'll have some tension on it, pulling some of that extra stuff out. So compare that side to this side.
Now we have both bottom seat cushions done for the inserts, so we're going to continue on to other pieces. Get yourself some speaker box carpet. Only spray one side of it, and you have pretty much a piece of material that can protect your table for pretty much ever. And then also, if you're trying to put some pieces together, assembling a seat, assembling a panel or something like that, you need something to protect so you're not scraping against the wood and running your panel. There's a nice little soft-sided material. I'm not a big fan of people carpeting tables permanently, because if they're disassembling seats on top of there, the staples and hog rings and what have you can get lodged in that stuff. So I always have something that's separate. Whenever I'm done using it, just roll it up, set it aside, and got my nice table for patterning again. So these seats, we're going to be adding piping where this French seam is to give it a different kind of styling look. So I'm going to show you how to make piping, also known as welting. So I have this guide here for 5/32 piping. And all I've done really is just mark it on the material and then just move it by one width. The width of this is pretty close to 1.5 inches, but it's not. I will show you how I got the distance that I need this made. But this guide is just a piece of MDF that I just ran down the table saw. But I'll show you how exactly I got this measurement for the width of the 5/32 piping for vinyl. So I'm going to cut a portion of it off here and give me a little scrap piece of material. I'm also going to switch my pressure foot and my walking foot to one actually meant to accept welting. So from above it looks about the same, but as you can see it has a half circle cut out of it, allowing a guide point for the welting to actually go through right next to the stitch. And so does the walking foot itself, has the opposite, about a quarter circle cut out of it. So I'm going to switch on to the machine and I'm going to show you how we get started. So you're going to take a piece of piping or welting. You're going to take your piece of material, take your piping, and you're hug it around it. Bring it all the way to the end. So I'm not, at this point, I'm just trying to get my width, so I don't really care about these lining up or not. So I'm going to just do this willy-nilly. And see, that channel is allowing me to push that welting pretty much all the way through in that little area, that channel. So I'm going to pick this up with my knee. I'm going to drop it back down. So right now that piping is sandwiched by the material wrapped around it, and then you should be able to go ahead and start stitching. And as you can see, it's literally locking that down in place. So now to figure out the width that you need, all you have to do is add your salvage on the back side of this, cut it off, and then take the whole thing apart and see what the width of that is, and that's going to be your guide. Now I'm going to add my 1/2 inch salvage onto this. So the salvage is going to go basically it's right up to the welting itself. As you can see, the ruler wants to automatically go past that stitching. That's perfect. So that's going to be where your stitch is when you're actually stitching this on a material, because you want to cover that first stitch so that you don't see the stitch line right next to the piping. You want to just be able to see the piping itself. So with my space pen or pencil, I'm going to mark 1/2 inch, a couple places. You see, I'm not going from the stitch, I'm pushing it a little further to the actual edge of the piping. I'm going to cut along that line. So ideally when we make our piping or our welting, this is what we want to be left with before we add it to the material. So if I separate this, cut the stitches out, then whatever the width is of this whole entire piece, so the width of this is exactly what we need to make for our 5/32 welting to go on vinyl. And it looks like we're just a hair past 1.5 inches. So we're about 1 5/8 inches is what we need to make all of our welting pieces for. To figure out what length we need, basically what I do is use a tape measure and I measure the parameter of the piece that it's going to be going on. And I like to add 2 inches on both sides. So 2 inches on this side, 2 inches on that side. So the whole length should be at least 4 inches longer than the actual edge that's going to be riding against. So whenever I do my piping, I just leave my roll somewhere that I can just roll it out as I'm going. I don't pre-cut my inside foam core. I just let it be.
I start with about 1 inch overhanging the material, and then I fold the material over the edge, putting end to end together, putting both of these pieces together. Then just feed it through the machine, and just like we did to make our guide to figure out what width we needed, I'm just going to keep on going through the whole entire material here, all the way to the end. As I'm going here, I'm trying to pay attention and make sure that my vinyl edge from that cut edge is staying on top of each other. You want that as parallel as possible throughout the whole entire thing. I try to do all my piping at one time, at least for the seat that I'm working on. So I'm going to go ahead and do my lock stitch. And then I'm going to go ahead and move the inside core about 2 inches forward. I'm not cutting my thread or anything like that. And I'm going to put my next piece of piping on here. And then just like before, we're going to lock stitch at the beginning, lock stitch at the end. And just rinse, wash, and repeat as many times for the pieces of welting that you have for your desired project. Piece of piping is going to be going between these two pieces. This body that I've already sewn, which has pretty much a straight line, and then this big old curve. It's easier to put your piping on the straight line first, and then you attach the two pieces together afterwards. So that's what we're going to do. And basically, like, we're starting our piping again. I'm going to put edge to edge. See that I'm overhanging this. Make sure that your piping, your welting, falls in that channel again. And I'm going to sew the two together. Right here is a pretty good learning lesson here. So somewhere my thread has been snagged, probably by the needle. I'm going to go and stop what I'm doing right now. I'm going to raise my needle up. Pull that off. Pull past where the problem is. The problem's about here. But I can see that the thread is still catching in this area here, so I'm going to pull down even further until the thread is consistent and good again. Cut it off. Rethread the eyelet here. Bring it back through my needle. And then through the walking foot. I'm doing this in an unsafe manner. You should probably have the machine turned off while you're actually doing this. Anytime your fingers are around this area, try to keep the machine turned off. I'm just stubborn and I'm very comfortable with my machine, so that's the only reason why I did that. Alright, back to what we were doing. Set this here. We're going to lock stitch just like we did earlier. And then we're just going to sew with the welting on top of our material here. Just kind of like we were when we were making our welting. Getting close to the end now. We're going to lock stitch again. And then I'm not going to cut any of this off just yet. I'm going to sew my other two pieces together. Find my starting point. Now it's just a huge sandwich, so it's almost like we're putting the red against the red to sew those two together. We just have a piece of piping between the two now. Make sure it falls in the channel. And then, just like always, lock stitch and continue stitching, watching your alignment marks. As you can see, my alignment marks are actually underneath the blue, so I've got to lift up a little bit to see exactly where that alignment mark is on the bottom piece of material. just like that, we now have blue piping put in there. So I have a small problem that I want to show you guys that happens with welting more times than it probably doesn't happen. So it's a good time to point it out. So right here, if I put tension on this material, you can see that white thread peeping through a little bit. So there's a couple ways to correct that, and there's a couple ways to make sure that doesn't happen, or at least doesn't happen where it's seen by the human eye. So if I would have stitched my welting, when I made my piping itself, if I would have used a dark blue stitch to match this, then that little area would have just looked more like a shadow than it would be sticking out like white thread. And then on top of that, if I would have put pressure on my foot, so whenever I had all my material going through it, if I would have just put a little bit pressure pushing this piping this direction, it would force the needle to go down through the foot with a little bit more tension onto the inside of the piping than the outside of the piping, alleviating being able to see that. But I have a trick that I usually use on my final pass that works fantastic. The only problem with it though is you're just going to have the walking foot on it. This walking foot here, which looks like a V, usually comes with a double welting foot, which isn't something we're going to get into today. But as you can see, it's more of a V than it is a quarter circle at the very bottom of that thing. And what I've found is that using this paired with the pressure foot that has the actual groove for the piping in it, it gets a little bit closer to the edge of the material and gets that needle pushing down right by the welting foot, closer than what it was with this walking foot, allowing that outside stitch that you kind of see with that white to be closer and covered up. So I'll show you what I'll do now to fix that issue. So I've simply just switched out that walking foot from the one with the 1/4 inch circle that goes with this pressure foot, and I've switched it over to the V groove walking foot. And now all I'm going to do is just re-stitch this again, but this time I'm going to make sure, oh there, that's actually a very good example. When I put my pressure foot back down, you can see that it just automatically wants to bring the tip of that foot and the needle inside closer than what we previously wore on that last pass. So now whenever we're stitching, it's going to go just a hair closer. Let me go and back stitch right here. You can see it's just a hair by the tip of these nippers right here. It's just a hair further in now. But that's all you need to make that stitch disappear. So I'm going to go and pass through this whole entire thing and I'll show you the results. So now you can see I've got 2 stitches here, and the other one is just a little bit further than the first one was. So that just is switching out that walking foot. Let me see if I can't show you the results now in the same problem area. This area right here is the same area that we had that issue was before. And you can see if I put a lot of tension on it, you can see the thread a little bit, but you don't no longer see that whole entire path of stitches. All you see is a little ball of stitch between the 2 pieces of material. So easy way to correct that. So now I'm at a point where I'm going to be sewing through the back side of all of this piping and this big old thickness of material. And so now right here in this little area we have 4 layers of material. So when I stitch these 2 pieces together, going through that could be a little bit of a hazard because it's so thick and it could put a lot of resistance on the machine. So we're going to do a couple of things to alleviate some of that. So we know we're going to sew in a 1/2 inch because that's what we chose our salvage length to be. So 1/2 inch from this edge. It's going to end up right about there. I'm going to take, without cutting my thread, I'm just going to cut the back side of the salvage. I'm going to cut a little bit past that point, and then just veer off like that, allowing this area to have as little bulk as we can get away with. The length of the stitch that I've done, I try to stay that same distance away width-wise whenever I'm cutting right against the material. Now here we have piping, so we have a couple different stitches on here, so we just want to make sure that we're away from the most inside stitch that amount. So from the inside stitch, I'm trying to stay about an 1/8 inch away. So I have these opposite of the way I'm going to sew them. You know, this piece is actually in the bottom for this process. But as you can see, I have this big curve right here on the white port. And then I've got a pretty mild curve here. Whenever I stitch these 2 together,
when I get to this point, it's going to be a lot of stress on that top piece of material to get these two alignment marks to line up with one another. So what I'm going to do to alleviate some of that stress there is just cut my salvage. I'm going to put some relief points on there, and then I'm going to make sure to stay within that 1/2 inch tolerance. That's what I drew that line on there for. I'm going to try to stay in there by 1/8 inch. So I'm just going to cut some of these areas here. And what's going to do is alleviate all that stress, so I can, the area that these are opening up, that V that creates, is all resistance that would have been there if we didn't cut all that. So now we're more likely to be able to hit these points right on the money, because we have that resistance relieved with all those relief cuts like that. So notice that alignment mark is on point right now, and then my next alignment mark's right there. So if I move this back, you can see that it's right now we're en route for success. But all these little relief cuts we put in there, the more they open up, it shows us how much resistance we would have been trying to fight to get that to lay down straight. Boom. All right, we're good. Now we're going to continue on. We're getting to the thickness of the piping. Going to look at our future alignment marks to see which way things need to go. And now, even though our machine usually guides all the material underneath of it, we're going to have to give it a little help here where it's getting that thickness of that piece of piping. So what I do is I'm going to lay it flat here, know what the machine is going to be, predict what's going to happen, and then we're just going to go one stitch at a time. But I'm pushing some force on here, helping that bulk get underneath the needle, the walking foot and the pressure foot. And then usually when the walking foot, the inside foot, is up and over that edge, then I know I'm pretty good just to continue on. Alright, now that that final piece has been sewn on, I can go ahead and cut off all that extra length of welting that I have. My good rule of thumb is if it's not going to be in an area that I can staple down, just cut out about a 1/2 inch away from the edge. So about a 1/2 inch from the cross thread to make sure that it doesn't want to unwind, which is right there. And then also on the other side, this is going to be a point of stapling, so I'm going to leave this alone and leave it long until I actually go to apply this seat cover to that seat itself, and then I'll trim that back after I get a couple staples in this area here. It's worth pointing out right now too that this foam core welting sometimes likes to shrink in the hot sun after a couple of years, so it's super important that if it's an area that you're not stapling, that the welting itself gets sewn through, anchoring it into that location. And then the areas that get stapled, make sure that that core itself is stapled down in place too. If I was to cut this flat here and then didn't put a staple through the actual foam core itself, a couple years down the road, what's going to happen is that all that inside foam core is going to kind of creep up this area, and the whole welting is going to look zigzaggy. It's going to look like an inch worm moving along. So go ahead and make sure that you're anchoring that down, especially in boats and the marine applications. Currently I'm working on the top bolsters for the boat seats, and I've already got my piping stitched in between the two panels here. On this side I've got another panel to add, and then same with this side, I have another panel to add. So that's a lot of bulk to sew through, and as I showed you before, I like to kind of notch out where that seam's going to go through. This time I'm going to take it a little step further. I'm actually going to cut all the salvage off this thing about an 1/8 inch away from the inside seam. And what that's going to allow is the actual piping to sit with all that bulk. Right now this isn't stapled on, it's just chilling here. But all that bulk, that salvage in the back side that we kind of moved around here, we're going to have all that we have to move around. So instead of having to kind of manipulate all that, we're going to let it sit as natural as it wants to after we cut off the bulk side of that thing. So we're going to cut out about 3/8 of this, leaving about an 1/8 inch from the inside stitch to the edge there. So like I said before, the stitch length from the inside stitch is the distance I want to stay away. So I'm going to probably cut right about there. And you may think, wow, that's really close to that stitch. This stitch isn't what's holding everything together anymore. This inside stitch is. So I'm going to actually cut the whole entire edge, to salvage off the whole entire thing out of each one of these. Now I've cut all that bulk off. So you can see I left a little bit of a ear right here. And it's because if I can get away with it, if it doesn't actually show through the seat, I like to leave all my stitch edges all the way through. So I didn't cut either one of these stitches, so that lock stitch is still present there. Now if I cut all the way through that, that stitch could still be held on with the tension of the area that's intersecting it. But I'm not going to take the chance, especially on a boat seat that are kind of more wear and tear than they are a luxury item. I'm going to leave that long, and then whenever I roll it around, I'm going to hope that that bulk doesn't show up on the backside. Right now I'm about ready to start doing the headrest, and the face of the headrest has an inside piece and an outside piece that has a double fell on it, and we're going to kind of mimic the same exact thing. Getting this corner here could be a little bit difficult, especially if you get off your alignment marks in one corner. When you get around to the second one, everything's all kinds of off. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples on the best way of making sure that that doesn't happen to you. So working with these pieces, having the concave and the convex pieces just like we talked about. The concave is going to be on the bottom, convex on top. And this is basically going to try to turn into a straight line. But you notice that if I try to stretch this into a straight line, it gets all kinds of crazy. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a couple of leaf cuts around these angles here and here, so that it's a lot easier to make this thing straight whenever we're rounding these corners with the material, adding the stitch. I'm going to show you how we're going to do that. We're going to cut these leaf cuts. I've drawn this, which is just shy of a 1/2 inch, which is going to be our sewing tolerance. So if we sew this correctly, this line will be covered. But I'm going to cut every 1/2 inch around these radiuses, allowing some of that strain release so that we can get around that corner, making this piece straight as it's going through the machine. Now if you pull this thing straight, you can see how those relief cuts relieve all that pressure in that corner, so it's a lot easier to sew around. On your blind stitches too, if you make your thread a little bit lower in length compared to what you normally do in your top stitches, it helps you around tight angles and stuff like that. So right now, my top stitches I usually run at a 6.5 on this machine. Right now I've stepped that length down to 5. You can see here, it looks like I'm missing an alignment mark, and I am on the top piece, but I'm not concerned about that. I know that my piece is oriented the way it needs to be. So now we're getting close to that corner, and as you can see, if I pull this into a straight line, you see all that relief and pressure for each one of those relief cuts we've made. Keep an eye on where our actual alignment marks are going to be hitting. So it's here and here is what I got to line up. It doesn't look like they're going to make it right now, but we're going to start making the two pieces start turning on top of each other, making those pieces line up, writing that radius. Okay, and the next one's right here and here. Notice I'm putting a little strain on the bottom piece while I'm letting the top piece stay relaxed. Okay, so we're through the first corner. So if we did our job correctly, we should have our alignment marks still lining up pretty good. As you can see, they are. Okay, we're over to corner number 2 now. Just look at how much that pressure is released just with those relief cuts. It's crazy. Notice I'm just walking the machine too. I'm not trying to go consistent. I'm not trying to stay 100 miles an hour the whole entire time. That's especially important when you're starting out. Now both these pieces are sewn pretty well together, but you can see that there's little puckers where all the strain is still kind of there, you know, because you can see this material isn't relaxed. There's still quite a bit of strain on there. And so we can cut these a little bit closer to the thread. I still want to stay at least a 1/16 inch away off of that. But that shows you why a lot of people, whenever you see these done in factory seats, have that extra stitch on top. And what that does is basically keep the tension between these two pieces a little bit more average between those. So we're going to do the same thing too. So this is the opposite side of those headrests here. And as you can see, if I want to lay all this material down this way, all this bottom material is going to start buckling. and it's going to cause little weird details to be rose up on the top side. If I did the double fell, put the top stitch on this side of the material, there's going to be like a little bit of a mashed potato corner, is how I'm going to call it right now. You know, it's going to be real lumpy. So we don't want that. So there's a couple things you can do. So this corner here, you see I've cut about every 1/2 inch, and see how they're overlapping each other. So that's going to get a little bit cleaner of a look, but also you're going to have double thickness in some areas compared to some areas that are just going to be one thickness. So what I do is I use my notchers, which cut a triangle out instead of my scissors like I did on this one, and it allows them to sit side by side instead of on top of each other, causing the thickness all the way around the whole entire corner to be a lot more uniform. Now we've got this double fell done. I didn't mean to make these a little bit different, but they kind of were, with the caveat of me showing you the difference between cutting with scissors and cutting with my notchers. So I went back and cut with the notchers so that I got those triangles out of both sides. But what happened is that whenever I cut with the notchers, let me see if I can get you a little detail there. If I cut the notchers, the angles, the 1/2 inch space between each one was a little bit closer together, so it was more like 3/8 and 1/2. Excuse me, it was more like 3/8 instead of 1/2 inch between each one. And this wide was a 1/2 inch. So you can see that I have got the overlapping there. So for detail, let me show you exactly what that looks like. You know, this corner is pretty darn smooth. No big lumps or anything like that. Pretty consistent through the whole thing. This one, you can almost see a little stair stepping going on. And what that is a hard peak from that salvage getting layered on top of one another, causing a little point to exist. I can massage a lot of this out. I'm going to cut a little bit more of the salvage away from this edge too, and hopefully going to correct that. We'll show you what that's going to look like real quick too. I wouldn't have normally cut some of the salvage to clean this area up, but I'm going to try to clean up this corner a little bit. So now this was a good corner, and this is the one that I massaged into being a lot better than what it was. So they're pretty consistent side to side. And how I basically did that was I just cut some of that salvage away, and I'll make sure that it's symmetrical. So if I don't get all the salvage off past the stitch, I'll at least do it in this corner too, so it's symmetrical. And then all I basically did was take this tool here. You could use a 4140 and basically just push along that peak around that area, knock them down inside, so that whenever the material relaxes, it's in a different position than what it was when it was sewn. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and start the second headrest. So we're going to make sure all of our salvage is on the inside, like just shown on that first one. Using our guide edge foot here. And notice that whenever I'm doing my safety stitch, I'm making it really narrow. I'm just doing one stitch forward and backwards. And I'll show you why that is here in the next piece we put on here. I'm going to take my time here because I'm paying attention more of not getting in your guys' way than I am the actual seat cushion itself here. So whenever you make those relief cuts here on the backside, the salvage could real easy just flip over like that. And then whenever you're sewing it, it'd be inconsistent through the whole entire turn. So make sure that whenever you get into the radius area, make sure you're paying attention, putting a finger underneath there and making sure everything feels flat and the orientation it needs to before it goes down into the needle. Making sure my bulk right here feels consistent through the whole thing. So just like a lot of things in fabrication world, the second one always turns out better than the first one, no matter what you decide to do about it. So as you can see, everything is nice and flat on the back side, allowing our corners to be nice and buttery smooth. Now, the reason why I made this so shallow for my safety stitches is that this gets another piece on top of it. And so if we weren't careful, let me use another piece for an example here. if we weren't careful, whenever we sew this thing through, there's a chance that it would pucker through like this if it was too long. So we want to make sure that it stays within that 1/2 inch salvage, or whatever salvage we decide to put on that. So make sure it's behind that 1/2 inch area that you're going to sew on top of if you have another piece connecting to it. Now I have my second piece sewn onto that as well, and you can see I don't have any of my safety stitch sticking through because I made it nice and shallow. So it's just underneath the salvage and it doesn't poke through on both sides. So trying to stay true to show you my mistakes. So here I had my alignment marks lined up. Well, so I thought, until I got to this area here and I was like, what the hell's going on? So I'm about one alignment mark too far in the future. So these two line up, but as you can see, all this bagginess isn't going to disappear anytime soon. So I've lined these up in the wrong area. I'm going to show you the best way to correct that. First, you're going to unstitch the two pieces. So luckily where this is the bottom side of the headrest, so you're not going to see it anyways, but either way, we're not going to stitch in a 1/2 inch because that's going to put us right in the same area and you're going to have a possibility of seeing those holes. So we're going to use this as a guiding point, the old stitch line, and instead of putting the edge on our 1/2 inch marker like I have tape on here, we're going to actually ride that stitch between the walking foot and the pressure foot. So right between those two areas. It's going to bring it in about a 1/16 of an inch, which could be problematic in some areas. This one, it is not. It's not too big of a detail. Now, if this was to happen here, I would either have to come in on the other side the same amount, making sure to really think about where I'm going to go here in the future, or it's just better off just to remake the piece so you know it's going to be symmetrical if it's a symmetrical piece, especially a headrest. Hard to do this one-handed. But you can see that my needle is just going a hair over, missing those holes, coming in a little further. Now, if we did this too close to one another, it could actually rip the material and make it a tear along that because you're kind of making a perforated line right next to your new stitch. If that happens, just remake the piece. Sometimes it happens, especially when you're starting out. You're going to be remaking a lot of pieces. Always keep your templates. I'm past my area now of the stitch mishap, so now I'm just gonna ever so slightly come over so that I'm now working off of this edge again. This point here shows you how sometimes the seams that you do on headrests make things a little bit harder to control. So I've got this big old ball of material that's starting to wrap around itself just because of the way this belt sits on this thing. So I want to show you guys how I struggle around this. Just know that this is normal and it's something you're just going to have to figure out how to deal with. So the only place that's really important is right here. What is happening between the two pieces of material and the needle? So all this stuff happened right here. I'm just making sure it doesn't put weird resistance on what's going underneath into the machine. It's less than the ideal scenario, but it happens more times than you think it may not. Whenever you're dealing with things, you may have seen, like, I picked up my foot there for a little bit. Sometimes using this foot in areas that you don't need to use it is more of a nuisance because there's a little spring that's holding this thing down on top of the material. And the back side of that, the hardware on the back side can catch the material and make things kind of snag and get caught up for a second. So, I mean, if I was starting out, I'd make sure to have just a regular foot on here, not one that has a guide on it. There we go. Kind of a weird shape. Just wait until we have to do the next stitch. Next stitch is going to be on the inside of this cover. Yeah, the inside. What we're basically going to do is the double fell that was on the factory seat right along the perimeter of it. So right now we're a little bit compromised because of the amount of salvage material that we left on the back side to actually staple. So this line right here that's drawn is also on the front side of this material, and it shows me where I'm going to wrap that material around and staple it. So I don't want to say all the material here is useless, because it's going to be a handle actually to tug on the material to get it right where you want before you put your staple. But we're gonna put a cut along here so that we can kind of open this up a little bit more than what we can at the current moment. I want to keep it at least a ½ inch from the edge, so I'm going to split this difference here, and then I'm going to come up 2 different directions, Y and off, and probably stop cutting right there. I'm also going to draw a little ball on the end here, and the reason why I did that is I'm going to actually cut a radius here instead of just a straight line to a peak, because if I drew a straight line and I end up putting a lot of tension on that, the material is going to have a very good likelihood of just ripping all the way through, and then I've got to redo this whole entire thing. Putting the radius right here puts a little bit more of a strain and stress on this area, so that when it does see tension, it doesn't have a straight line to rip from. It just has a radius. So you still can rip it, but it's going to be a lot harder than if it was just a straight blunt line. So that allows me to open this cover up a lot more, comparatively. So I'm going to show you what it looks like whenever I'm sewing this double fell. Making sure my salvage on the bottom side, it's all one direction. I'm in this area that I'm putting tension on these 2 parts here, so I'm making sure not to put too much tension on it while I'm going around this corner. Notice I'm kind of balling this material up a little bit just so I have better control of what's going through the actual machine itself. Probably walking about 1.5 inches to 2 inches every single time, and I'm repositioning. It's important to note too that the machine that I'm using always has it set up that anytime that I stop, the needle is actually poked through the material. If you're running a clutch motor or just a regular motor that doesn't have needle position, you want to make sure that anytime you're adjusting, that needle is punctured through the material. It doesn't really matter so much that it's dead nuts all the way down. It's just important enough that you know that the needle is through the material, so that whenever you go to adjust things, like I'm doing pretty consistently here, that your material is not going to move too much. Orientation of the headrest is kind of hard to tell right now, but I'm on the other corner now, that little tight tension area. I've already gone all the way around the back. I'm aiming to get to the front side now. It's also important to note that, as you can see here, headrests, even though a small portion of their seat, are actually harder than the rest of the big flat areas, because it's just a lot of tight motions that happen in a really small confined area. Once again, notice I'm not going 100 miles an hour here. This is an important stitch. I'm doing my best to make sure the tension's the same, so my stitch length is going to be the same throughout the whole entire thing. There we are. And then if you note, it's kind of mashed potato-y. And the reason why is I didn't notch out every single part of this, but what I'm going to do is go back through and cut that salvage real close to that second thread, releasing all that extra bulk that's pushing on the outside of the material. This is an edge, so the foam's going to push against the edges quite a bit, you know, to the 90-degree angles of the foam. Whereas to this was a little bit more important because it's just on a flat plane. There's no pressure of the foam pushing against it because it's all on the same plane. That change of planes is really what's going to help kind of push this edge out. Alright, these seat covers are just sitting on the seat now, so we're about ready to attach them. So I'm going to take everything apart again, and we'll start with the middle inside. Then the bolsters, get the bottom bolster, the bottom insert put in, and then we'll work on the headrest. Alright, the seat cover is pretty simple. We're just going to make sure that all of our salvage is laying the same direction, as flat as can be, and then we'll staple it on. I'm going to start with my centers, stapling the centers where they want to be, then the centers these sides, and then we'll work to the corners. We want to make sure that our diamonds are centered, so I just marked center on the actual back of the board. You can do this chalk or wax pencil. I did it with a Sharpie here. Probably wasn't the best idea. Shouldn't be a problem though, considering it's so far from the edge. You're not going to see it if it does bleed through all the material. So now I'm just going to pull this. We've marked those lines on the edge. That line should be exactly where it wraps around and reaches the other side. So we're going to pull to that edge and then staple down the middle. We're working on a marine boat right now, obviously, so we're going to want to use stainless steel staples. That way they're not going to start rusting as much as galvanized staples would. Our bread and butter staple is a 3/4 inch, which I have the box somewhere else. They are stainless steel, but these are 3/8 crown 22 gauge staples. That's kind of the go-to for automotive upholstery and marine upholstery. Prime Stitch is my favorite brand out of all the staples I've used. They just seem the most consistent and they're pretty high quality. So now if we're happy with the stretch just by putting the centers down, we're going to go ahead and continue our straight lines as a guide. If we want more tension, we can pull a little bit more, but the idea is to keep our line that we marked on the edge as straight as possible. I mean, the guide is meant to be on this edge, but if it was too loose, I mean, I have no problem pulling a 1/4 inch past, but I want to make sure that the line is pretty parallel with the edge here, so that this line here is pretty parallel with the bottom of the seat. Alright, now these two lines are stapled down. I've got to staple about every inch. I'm going to go ahead and leave all triple of these, but depending on how the back side's kind of seen and finished out, depends on if you can get away with doing the triple staples here. If I couldn't get away with doing 3 staples there, I would have done 3 side by side. And the reason why I have 3 instead of just 1 right there is it's a lot of tension whenever you're just doing like one little central point on the material. So that kind of just gets that tension and spreads it out a little further. Kind of looks like I bombarded this edge with a bunch of staples, and I mean, I guess I did. The reason why I did though is I'm about to cut through all of these stitches here, and I want to make sure that each stitch has a staple that isn't breaking the thread, but is holding it anchored before I cut the rest of this extra material off. The seat cover is done. We'll go on to the next pieces. So we're going to start with this bottom bolster. The seat's on its side right now. We need to find a good anchor point to start. So we basically have the piece sitting exactly where we want it. We have our space pin mark that's going to be used as a guiding point to show us where our pivot point's going to be. And right here, this corner here seems like a pretty good area to start. It kind of pulls things down into place. So that's where I'm going to anchor it and then work from that point on. Kind of got ahead of myself and went and stapled this the rest of the way off. I don't have a tripod here or anything like that, and it was really hard just to manipulate this and get a good video of it. But anyways, I anchored there, and then I kind of pulled the whole entire cover all over the top until I had like most of the tension out of it and kind of positioned where I wanted to. And then went from that position here, pulled the cover off, or pulled the cover on, and then basically anchored this point here, and then just kind of followed suit with everything, making sure my lines here are straight to keep the piece here, the welting, as parallel to the bottom of the cushion as possible. Both bolsters are put on, so now I'm going to go and start with that center insert on the bottom. And we're basically just going to put this thing together just like we took it apart. It's, like I said, it's really hard for me to kind of record some of those things of actually putting the covers on, so I'm going to kind of just get through this thing. Alright, bottom inserts put in place now. Basically just looked at my pictures on how it was attached last time. Now I made sure not to clean the bottom of the seat, so I just basically used the dirty marks as my reference on where things needed to go, and got everything attached just how it was beforehand. And if you remember how wrinkly this was before, now it's been pulled tight, it's a nice consistent line. Getting this back pulled around, I'm noticing I've got some lumpiness right here. So I can fix some of this with heat, but I'm going to go ahead and go through and then cut the salvage off the back side of this from this area up on both sides. Alright, and it's all said and done. So I'm going to go through a couple things that I would have liked to do differently if I had a chance to do the seat over again. Obviously, I have this whole entire thing I got to take apart to put the new covers on, but the new covers are already sewn. So I'm going to go through some of those things now that I'd like to change. As you can see here on the factory seat, this darker piece of material kind of smushes out further. It's not so much a straight line as much as this one is. And whenever I transferred the pattern, it kind of did the same exact thing. So the reason why this original one's like this is that whenever this seen sun for however long this has been out in use, maybe 10 years or so, this material has it's stretched more than this material has, given this kind of bow effect that kind of got locked on with this stitch for probably the first 5 years. After that stitch broke, things kind of went a little awry. But it's consistent on both sides. So that tells me that that is a problem. Now I noticed it up here, and I corrected it on the top pieces. I didn't think about going through and correcting on the bottom whenever I seen that. Something else I would have done is you can kind of see the salvage on the side of the seat. Luckily, the way this seat sits in this boat, you don't see the sides of the seats anymore. But if I was to do this whole thing over again, I probably would have foamed everything with 1/8 inch scrim foam instead of just some of the parts that I decided to do for kind of like the depth effects that you kind of see here. And then obviously we did the 1/2 inch that you've seen for the diamonds as well. Also in the back turned out pretty good, but I kind of wish I would have put some foam on the back side here. This will relax with a heat gun or some steam, or just sitting out in the sun for about 5 hours. So I'm not really too concerned about it, but I just don't like the way it looks whenever I do my comparison before I take this other seat apart. Other than that, I'm pretty happy with it.